to shut up.
Yeah,
At this point,
yeah.
I would just like to introduce Lydia and Tim. We are so lucky to both have them as faculty at Montserrat. Lydia, as y'all well know, had curated the Hans Hofmann exhibition at the PIM. He's the Associate Curator there. And Tim is a longtime wonderful faculty at Montserrat, an incredible artist in his own right, who has shown, from Boston to the West Coast, everywhere in between, in tons of different collections. It's just an incredible treat, not only for us, but really for the community to have these two people talk to us tonight. That's really me. I hope
Can I just hold this?
that's
Really? So that's fine, right? Okay. If I half joked to Lydia, if I had any idea there was going to be this amount of people, I would have thought a little bit about what we were going to talk about. As I say, I'm only half kidding. But what I did is I put together some slides with the help of Nathan and Kevin that I just hoped would prompt some of the things I like to talk about in regard to Hoffman when I'm not only in the classroom, but things that are still significant to me in my own work. So I'm just going to, if we can just see images, I think. So the piece on the right, well, what is that, the right, is called Rising Moon. That's a, I had the great fortune of working with John Grillo, really good American painter. Was a Hoffman student. He was a significant painter before he even came to Hoffman, which is true of a lot of people who studied with him. They had other teachers. John was out in the West Coast influencing people like Devenkon in the late 40s, but then came east to work with Hoffman. And one thing that always has struck me, many of the people that worked with Hoffman did have these other teachers, had worked with other people. And they almost all of them speak of him as like the best teacher they had. Even though they'd worked with really good teachers, there was something a little different about Hoffman. So I got Rising Moon because I have a real, when I was thinking of the talk, I gave it some thought. I remember having my first art magazine subscription to Arts in the 70s. And Arts magazine was like the best magazine years ago. Really great scholarship, great articles. The type of magazine you wish would write about your work. But I was just out of undergrad, barely got out of undergrad, and I had this first issue. Paul Klee was on the cover. I feel like Chuck Close because he once said he could remember every page of an art magazine. Well, for a few years it was a little like that for me. So I remember this issue particularly, and then coming to this ad, and Rising Moon was there. And I knew of Hoffman a little after being in art school in Amherst. But something about this moment, it was so visceral. It's like I got it for the first time. I think in the way it was in the back of my mind, it made me realize that I wanted to reconnect with John Grillo, who I didn't take advantage of as an undergrad. So, by the 80s, I had gone back to grad school and to work specifically with John. So this painting is kind of a touchstone for me, as I sometimes talk about, and kind of significant because it was the first time I saw this kind of what I characterize as a play of sizes and shapes. This kind of these relationships, and of course there was the weight of the paint, which we're all suckers for. So even in the reproduction, I was reacting to that. The one on the right, which is in the PEM show, I forget what it is. Something in tea kettle, studio interior. Yeah. But these were from the 30s, and you can read about these sometimes and have people characterize them as like they were not missteps, but kind of Hoffman on his way to more mature work. I think these works are really significant to me. I love the marriage of abstraction and and representation. They influenced people like Robert De Niro's father, who was a really good painter. It still had that kind of, really was De Niro's painting is almost all in debt to this and Matisse. And of course Hoffman's coming out of Matisse, you know. So I just always loved this kind of, you know, the use of painted line, colored line and paint, and still this degree of representation. It's always important to remember. I'm always reminding my students, you know, for the most significant abstract painter in my mind, he had people work from the model in the morning and work from the still life setup in the afternoon. He didn't come in and just abstract. It was always about working from a source, seeing dynamics, seeing forces, seeing relationships, you know. And so when he kind of returned to paintings, it took his visit in Gloucester, from what I understand, and Mercedes Matters getting him back into paint, telling him to paint, because he was moaning about not painting, I guess. And he kind of started to do these interiors and stuff. So they kind of a significant work as he gets back into truly painting in America after really doing a lot of drawing.
And can I ask you questions
Yeah,
when
sure.
you're talking?
I may not be able to answer them.
What I have sort of done in the exhibition is actually, we don't have this painting,
Right.
but we do have another larger painting like this from the late 60s called Sanctum Sanctorum. And what I've done is I've also paired it on the same wall with an early
Right.
work. Can you talk a little bit about that relationship?
Well,
Because they're almost 30 years apart.
Yeah,
right?
but I think, I mean, it's a great thing, because the reason I put, if you came into my classroom, this type of juxtapositions there all the time, because really the same thing's going on. Mm-hmm. I talk about this as a synthesis. There's a piece I want to talk about more in that regard. Mm-hmm. But, you know, and he's, art historically, of course, it's an incredible synthesis of him in terms of Matisse and Picasso and Kandinsky and people he worked with. But again, the synthesis of kind of representation and things standing in for things is the way I talk about things being equivalents, you know. So you know, he gets a little further away from this in magenta and blue, which is coming up, you know.
Okay,
it's but really, you know, as I say, he was such a believer in still having this thing that you bounced off of, that I kind of had a strong feeling that things are actually standing in for amounts or ratios, and not really a big difference, you know. So
I love that.
it's a difference in language, as I always say, visual, you know, descriptive language, but not a difference in painting language, you know.
Brilliant.
And this was, I just wanted to put a couple of John Grillo's paintings. It's as impossible, maybe more impossible. He lived longer than Hoffman. He just died a couple years ago, lived into his 90s. So it's impossible to show you a couple John Grillo's, because he's probably the most prolific painter I ever knew, and I don't say that about anybody. He had them under the eaves of his roof for crying out loud. Just, but this is from the this is from the 50s, and I can remember, you know, I was a real sucker for these. When he would pull them out, and he said, "Oh, we were all doing those," you know. So, and you'll find Mike Lowe, who's a great painter, did a lot of these. You know, they were John's. What I like about his, it's still kind of a Hoffman connection, is that there was a little different sense of counterpoint to them. They were very musical feeling. He was a great colorist. This is later 60s. I need to explain too, just like the Hoffmans, this is probably the size of the red wall behind Lydia. So you're talking about this big kaleidoscopic thing, you know. But it gives you some idea. This has that change of weight, you know, everything from paint dragged on to impasto, just like you get to see in those Hoffmans over in the museum. So I as I say, I feel fortunate to have worked with him, and then we ended up staying pretty close right up to his last days. So I had some sense of. I feel like I feel a student of mine asked me the other day, and I think my teaching is some synthesis too of him and obviously Hoffman lessons, but And then, like any of us who teach, there's things you realize you made up, and they don't come from anybody. And some of these people would probably look at it and say, "What the hell are you doing?"
Amazing.
So I wanted to show these two because people who have worked with me, studied with me in the classroom, I'm talking now 30 years, so back at the Dakota, back at UNH, I probably have had this image put on the wall with all my image groupings all the time. And it's for the reasons I said. I talk about big divisions in work, so how the picture plane is divided, which was so important to Hoffman. But also this idea of synthesis. So sometimes I like showing this. Synthesis is my way of talking about abstraction. So again, things stand in for things. Things are equivalent. You can feel it as another artist studio or interior or a still life, but it's with this kind of abbreviated language and kind of invention. So magenta and blue's always kind of been a kind of significant painting to me. And then this image of him in the studio, I knew it wouldn't really show up in a way that we could maybe see it, but I like showing that to people because if you see this is in the, well, it's in a couple books, but the Cynthia Goodman Small Abbeville book. If you see it up close, you'll realize a lot of the colored pieces of paper behind him are actually push-pinned in. Now, he didn't really do collage. He might have done some, but it wasn't really collage in itself. But it's a real reminder, as I always say, maybe the most significant colorist in my mind. And yet, these are late period paintings. He's playing with ratios and amounts and evaluating them. And it's a reminder that a collage sensibility is kind of at work with most painters worth a damn, I believe. Because it isn't about using paper or stuff, it's about adding and subtracting, changing amounts, changing relationships. But you can almost see it up at the top of the image. You can see the couple, yeah. So, I mean, he knew color more than more than I would ever pretend to know. And yet he's still, he's not assuming he knows it here. He's actually seeing it and seeing what it sets off, because that's what it is. It's a behavior all of a sudden and a consequence when you add that color. So he's playing with amounts like that. So I always like that photo because sometimes I get people taking collage and they don't connect with the motive or the reason for the collage. And I always explain, but as a painter, it's helpful to know that you can evaluate, areas and inform your decisions,
So we have this painting in the show, and I'm curious, Tim, when you look at this, can you tell where he started?
No. I would maintain there's big divisions first. A painter is dealing with big zones. He's not starting with this. I feel pretty safe on that. But other than that, and this is in the wake of the hurricane. I think that's at the Pen too. And it's interesting because I think that's 60. Can you see that? 62, 60?
I think it's 1960.
60.
Yeah.
Because sometimes you see those colored plain ones, and and they're treated like that's the late blossoming work, great work, without a doubt. But really, these things were going on at the same time.
Absolutely.
So and that's the other thing. Again, I got from John Grillo is he could be working on a figurative work, and then the next day, purely abstract. They didn't make those distinctions. Those distinctions are nonsense. They're making paintings. It's like Duke Ellington being asked what kind of music he likes. He says he likes good music. So it's like. So this is one of my paintings. Who the hell knows what year? I don't know. But they were like, this was a series from my son's.
Is this a view from?
Yeah, a view from Andrew's room. Yeah, and I clearly was thinking of both Hoffman and Grillo. I don't mean literally, but the vocabulary is about this kind of abstracting of the view of the view from my son's bedroom window. So this is our garage, and there's a couple fences. But there were over 100, more than 100 of these from '93 on, after Andrew was born. Where sometimes they were kaleidoscopic, like the Grillo one. Sometimes they were a little bit more landscape, literal, and sometimes with that, I'm a little presumptuous to have mine up next to his, but sometimes they were physically painted like that too. So it was all about exploring different languages, but really with the same view. That's what the series was. So, and again, the kind of idea that things are standing in for things. Mm-hmm. This was this half bench we used to have when we first moved in. And for a while, I was putting those things out in the yard so they were there. And I was doing it from a window with a rough drawing. And I don't know, I'm a little slow. And it took me some months to realize I don't really have to put the objects out in the yard. If I'm painting them like this, so that's that. And here's the landscapes of Hoffman excite me, and his drawing excites me. And this is one of my large charcoals from Andrew's room, and again, kind of letting line have a different role, a different kind of physicalness, which is what I always liked, in Hoffman's drawings, and watercolors and things, that kind of looseness. But when he was first out in Berkeley in the 30s, when those couple of guys got him out there, he was purely just drawing. There was no painting. So it's an interesting vocabulary being developed at that time.
What happens to line in his work? I mean, we see it here.
I think it's what I call, it's kind of being given a kind of revitalized role. So it's not just bounding things. It's not literal contour. It's sometimes energy. It's sometimes moving into space and coming back. So it's got a little. Sometimes it's lyrical, clearly, but and sometimes there's a kind of an accumulative kind of, there's that looseness to his mark sometimes. But sometimes it's sometimes almost funny. I mean, it's funny when you look at that first room, and there's the three kind of more literal landscapes on the wall. Mm-hmm. And John used to do this too. There's a few of those. John used to come up to your painting, and this was said about Hoffman as well. He could come up behind your painting and do a little diagram up in the corner, and just ruin you for for weeks. You think, what? And I had this bad habit of seeing everything the opposite. Like I realized I'd been looking at it the opposite, and he just cleared it up, with this little diagram. And it's lots of Hoffman drawings by his students that have that presence. If you see Hoffman drawings, sometimes there's a little bit of a notational drawing up in the corner is more often than not Hoffman's own little thing. I don't know what the hell I was beginning to say.
I think we were talking about line and the role of line, and you were talking about it as sort of like in your language of synthesis and sort of the essence of line, but not necessarily always being a representational line, but transitioning into a color or a mark or the energy.
Yeah, that's very nice.
It's brilliant material.
Yeah. It dawned on me about 10 years ago in the classroom to stop saying to students, I got 3 things I want to tell you. Because I could never get to 2.5. But my mother would say it couldn't have been too important. So.
Amazing. Okay.
And this is, I just juxtaposed Cathedral, which is one of the great late ones. I don't know if that's 52 or something, 58 maybe, I don't know. And this is one of my collages, again, who knows from when, 2012 maybe, I'm going to say, around that time. Mine's called Table, but this is I've been talking about what I didn't really say about the line. Hoffman's important in the classroom to me because really, as students know, they're very used to what I call a structural search drawing that looks very much like Giacometti on the nth degree, to the nth degree. But the truth is, what I talk about is establishing things simultaneously, and that's really Hoffman. It's the Giacometti is the language, but the impulse to move and see things in relationship simultaneously, not one at a time, not piece by piece, is really Hoffman's idea of movement, and so everything's being responded to. So he's important to me personally in the classroom for drawing. I know there's things I've internalized as a painter, but there's a whole. I couldn't give you 50 slides of my work either, because there's a whole body of work of mine that's purely about hard edge and these shifts of planes. So I have thousands of these that really obviously owe a debt not only to him but to Mondrian and other things that interest me. So while I have figurative work, obviously, that people know pretty well, they're back to what we were talking about the earlier pairing. They're the damn same thing to me. Whether there's a figure, whether it's the damn same thing. They're abstract. They're a painting. I don't. I'll lose my language. But I don't. To me, it's a difference in the language of description. It isn't a difference in what I'm actually paying attention to in terms of decision making, changes of size, relationships. That's what needs to behave.
Yeah.
So, and I think there's a last pairing. Is there? Or did Nathan edit it on me?
Oh no!
No way.
I think there's two. You're right.
All right.
So this is I just wanted to slip this in because I had just recently found it and never seen it. It's a Grillo collage. John did amazing collages. John might be the only person who did collages, with the exception of Esteban Vicente, might be the one other of the 50s, the New York school, where their collages felt like action painting, felt like things were moving. Even when you think of Motherwell, it's kind of being placed and ordered or slattered. It's not this kind of, these things they seem to make paper move with this plasticity that's like paint, So this is kind of a wonderful one I hadn't ever seen. And this is a very little one of mine, so it's about that big. And ironically, the last piece, if we can go to the next,
Sure.
This palette will look very, this didn't dawn on me until I was putting this together, but this palette has a lot of reference to mine, just by coincidence.
I love.
Yeah, and this is the painting why I ran into you on the stairway that day. I went back to see this because I had to wait for the damn Halloween crap to get over and I got back, and I really wanted to go back to to get the name of this and see, because I remember standing in front of it, it's out of fashion to talk about. People don't pay as much attention to this. I think it doesn't seem. Maybe I shouldn't assume. But if you just stand in front of this painting, it's big. He has this like visual punning, because there's a lot of simultaneous contrast in his work. Where you're looking at it and all of a sudden it throws another color into the void. It's complement or some type of shadow image. But when you see this, you can only see it a little bit on this. If you go to the museum, that's a painted white that's almost echoing the effect of an after image. So it's like this weird little game he played. And I was looking at it because this still matters a lot to me. That color throws another color. I kind of put my name on my work once it does that. I figure that's it. So I was standing in front of that, and the silly scene in Encounters of the Third Kind there, with that stupid spaceship starts all of a sudden making all the music and stuff. It's like that's what it started to do. I realized, honestly, it started to seem like noise, like good noise, because I realized he was making my eye move all around it, But anyway, to end on one of mine is even my figurative work. It's really what I'm always thinking about. Is it's still about this integrity to the picture plane. Again, not everybody's thing anymore. But once you kind of believe it, you believe it. And you kind of look for it. You insist on it, some of us. And so it's the same things I look into, even when it's my representational work. So that's my portion.
How do I add to that? I don't even know what to say. I have a bunch of questions. I think I'm just gonna so I have some slides of the actual exhibition, but please come see it. And I would just love to talk about some of the paintings with you and what you see. So again, I asked him about the juxtapositions between early and late work. So this is in the first gallery where we're looking at his landscape work. And when I look at this, I see Frankenthaler.
Yeah.
I see the soak stain. But I would love to know what you see. And
it's an interesting one because I love this, because it's right in that. You might have picked one of the few that I really keep looking at and saying, I don't know.
Okay, all right.
I don't know. I mean,
well, we gotta have one.
Yeah, I mean that's not we're lucky to get a good painting done in our life. So it's but the Frankenthaler, because he did everything. There's a couple. What is that? Is it Agrigento there? What's the big one?
Agrigento.
And he's got a few things like that that are kind of amazing. Not that stain painting wasn't already showing up, but he does them at a scale where they're like monolithic shapes, almost like Stonehenge shapes, balanced on you. So I think that kind of washiness would make you think of her a little bit. I wouldn't be in a position to talk about her either. I like some, but I don't, But that one kind of just, things settled to the bottom for me too much. And so I don't know. There was a lot of area for me to forgive.
Yeah, it's different. It's when I was working on the show, I found that I figured out I didn't really know anything, right? Well, and I think what you were saying about Hoffman, he was working in the wake of the hurricane, and in that gestural abstraction mode, and then also doing the slab paintings, and in the same year. I mean, you can't really put him in this box. I mean, he's constantly evolving.
Well, the thing about that's often said, or at least as an explanation, is that, and again, my teacher Grillo had a little of this. Maybe more painters have this than we ever own up to, because it's kind of a myth. I mean, it's kind of questionable when there's a book on an artist and really from their youth to their old age, it's really the same. That's suspect. And so I think he often was a little marginalized and underestimated because it was that bouncing around and it wasn't being fully appreciated of just how free he really was with that, with his kind of explorations, So.
And once he finally picked up his paints again in the 30s, he, what we try to show in the exhibition is that he is constantly evolving. I'm going to give that to you. I was terrified. Sorry, everyone.
Wow.
Caspian is Saturday night.
Oh my gosh.
Jeez, I thought King Crimson just.
It was Hoffman. It was the energy. It was his spirit. I don't even know what I was saying.
Yeah,
I don't want that.
Okay.
My students know that I can really project, so we're just going to keep moving. So you mentioned Matisse, which I love.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about Cezanne?
Yeah, because this one's a more kind of a easy one because he's pretty much dealing with the genre and the whole notion of still life. But there's the Cezanne remark that sometimes is misattributed, where he says, color at its richest creates the fullest form, and it's I think that's a really important idea about when Hoffman starts to really doesn't break these things into tonal things, gradations. Not that he did much of that anyway, but they get really kind of pure. That's really a Cezanne thought, that we don't think of it because we think of other other kind of sensibilities in Cezanne, but that's Cezanne's remark, that it's a. So I think you also cannot. I mean, I know I'm going to go home and realize how the hell didn't I talk about this, but it just occurred to me we really haven't touched upon how important a cubist infrastructure really was to him, and so that's kind of there, and that even is what ends up in those strong big grid paintings essentially. So
Yes.
with the flatness too, with the shallow space, So.
Well, I'm going to ask you about. So this is the pairing I was talking about.
Ask me about this guy.
I know. Yeah. What's the color relationship here? And there's your magenta and blue. But we talk about push and pull. Hoffman talks about push and pull. Yeah. What do you think about that? You talked about the relationships and always thinking in relationships and counter forces.
And kind of simultaneously. I like to take the path of Mercedes Matters, who would study with him, had commented to Larry Rivers. I just found this again, and Rivers is kind of interesting because he kind of admits he didn't get him. He studied with him. A lot of people, but Rivers was upfront enough to say, I didn't get him. I got more of it from Nell Blaine, who was another great gloss artist.
Yes, of course.
So he studied with Nell Blaine, visited with her, and he seemed to be getting Hoffman from that. And I don't know if it's Rivers too. One of those people. I don't know if it's Rivers or Paul Georges or some Hoffman student once said, I don't know if I was getting Hoffman or if I was getting George McNeil, like who the monitor was, or Paul Scott, So, but the push-pull. So anyway, Mercedes' point is like, forget Hoffman's theories. It's better to look at the paintings. Some of the times, but the way I like it explained, I often say to my students, is that idea that if you're pushing something here, like there's a reference to a balloon, pushing the balloon and having a counter reaction. I just like the idea that there's a counter reaction, that it isn't happening over here piecemeal and being added, but there's it's happening like that. And you can't leave out just this idea that this more mysterious notion of this kind of plasticity of space, that they kind of feel like they're staying in kind of connected and malleable almost, and so that's but I wouldn't pretend. I mean, there's moments I get it. This is why I tell students you should read Search for the Real.
I was just say Search for the Real.
Yeah, read it at different times in your life, because at different times in your life, they say this about the Bible too, but I wouldn't know. But if you read it at different times of your life, you understand it differently. You're ready to understand it. A certain thing going on in your painting makes it so you finally get it. I have that kind of relationship with it. I sometimes pick it up again when I want to, and I read it and it sounds like gobbledygook, and then, but there's no substitute for standing in front of these things, I mean, you got a show on the North Shore that's just so unusual to see this caliber of artist and be able to return to it weekly for a while. It's not a New York show. It's bigger than a New York show. It's the collection from the Berkeley. So I'm always trying to encourage students to realize there's a reason, back to painting and back to what's out of fashion, possibly. There's a reason we make them. They're to be stood in front of. They're not to be seen on a phone or in a book even or on a screen. They're not to be seen virtually. There's a reason we still care. There's a reason he still has that weight to some of it. That everything from impasto to a gash. They're meant to be stood in front of so you see them behave. And I think, like, back to my point about the kind of simultaneous contrast and kind of musicality of that other piece, when you stand in front of them, you get a little glimpse of what he meant by push-pull. In the right ones, you get it, I think,
Amazing. I had my students come to the exhibition, and I gave them an assignment to write a review of the exhibition. And I will not name names, but I had a student here who wrote about this painting and the experience, as you're saying, of seeing this painting in real life, walking through this hallway. And she said that it was as if the painting was lit from inside. And I just love that. I think that is such an important observation in both the plasticity, but the experience.
Yeah, and his point that the color is light and it's making light. You know, it's like light comes from the piece. Light, it isn't being depicted. You know, so it's a.
Yep, amazing. So we just have some quotes. Did you go in the color room?
I walked through the color room.
It's not a James Trail piece, I promise. But it's an immersive experience of color. So
yeah, I get through those quick.
Yeah. Yeah. So did the critic from the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah.
So these are what I really knew about Hoffman before starting to dig into this project. These are, his work from the 1960s when he closed his school, went back to the studio full time, and I talk about the push and pull method as sort of the counter forces that he's emulating through the color and the squares and the gestural background. I had another second generation Hoffman student, I guess, in the gallery with me on Monday, and that was Frank Stella. And no pressure at all. And he wrote about these two paintings in an article in the 90s that claimed Hoffman as not only being the greatest artist of the 20th century, greatest art teacher of the 20th century, but actually a great innovator and painter himself. Yeah. And I was like, well, I put them next to each other in the exhibition, so let's go talk about them. And he went up to this painting, and he said, this was wrong everywhere else. And that all of the transitions were broken. And that's what made Hoffman. Like, he always could tell it was a Hoffman because of those, because of how he perceived that. I just wonder what you think about that.
What's the phrase again?
He said, I think he was talking about him as a teacher, and then internalizing all of his principles as an artist. And he said all of this was wrong anywhere else because all of the transitions were essentially broken between either the color planes or where he's leaving, negative space or white space, where he's splattering versus where he's anchoring in thick impasto. I'm just wondering if you like.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure. I wouldn't pretend to understand that, and I'm not sure what he. I'm not sure about the use of the word wrong. I mean, it might be. I respect what he might be saying there. I was thinking as you talked about it. One of the things, my real experience, because I had so much time to look at Grillo's work through the years, and I curated a couple shows of his, so I was able to continue to go down to them and look at them, So, and one of the things I always have said about John, and I don't know if this is related, but there would always be something that struck me like, I can't believe he did that. Like it would almost all the time there'd be something where I would think it was a decision that seemed a little counter what you would think, and that may not be it, but. I don't see it as wrong. I see it as a kind of big interval, But it's,
Oh, I love that, and feeling that there is this space to always experiment too within the same pictorial space.
I mean, I think he really was. That's why I feel uncomfortable. For years, I would probably even find myself saying some hit and miss, and I find myself uncomfortable even saying that. Who am I anyway? But but I honestly don't think that's really the case. I think it's he's letting the painting. You know, he flew through these too.
Yes.
You know? I mean, so he's purposely playing with all different languages, and you can decide this one didn't do it. And he might have. I don't know. You know, but
Yeah.
But he was pretty particular about his signature, so I think if we're seeing him,
I
you
know. I know. Yeah, he worked incredibly fast. He liked to finish.
But you know, the amazing thing to keep in mind when you get to see the shows, and this isn't even one of the big ones, the Indian Summer one, but some of those, I don't even know their dimensions, because as I was saying to students, they're amazing for having you forget the dimensions for a minute. Like I stand in front of them and think, holy, you know, this is larger than I and then I'm thinking he's 80 years old.
Yeah.
You know, he's doing these in the 60s, and I got kids doing 18 by 24 acting like it's a task, you know.
Well, just to go back
to
this is space.
Yeah.
I made this my office when we were installing. So there's a table kind of right in front of these paintings, and I just sat my computer in front of it and just worked from there. But what we've also done is, you know, we've raised them up a little bit, and they have really tall walls. And so that experience of having the painting like fall forward, fall into you, was, you know, intentional. And one of the other things I wanted to ask you about, you know, I tried not to put huge, large paintings together on the same wall. Right?
Yeah.
So that they like had sort of their own moment.
Yeah.
But also sort of, you know, have also a relationship, obviously.
No, I think that really succeeds. They need that space. You know, they need that space. I mean, that's when it's good, like these are. They need that space not because they're large paintings, but because again the behavior in them is really large. You know, it needs it for both reasons. You know, so
amazing. Did you touch?
I didn't do this either.
The tactile.
I appreciate it.
Yeah. So we have a tactile experience in front of this painting. So we had a company 3D scan the surface of Morning Mist, which is a stellar painting from Berkeley's collection. And so what you do, you can touch the mock surface of the painting and feel how much the rectangles are raised, you know, while you're looking at them, and the paint. And for me, it totally blew my mind because my eyes saw one thing. Like I understood this color was in front or behind this color, but my hand understood something completely different.
Maybe I should partake.
You should. But I mean, he does that in paint. Like he leaves you, I think, always surprised. When you're looking at these. Like you think you know what's going on, but the closer you are versus the further back you are, you have such individual experiences.
Yeah. Well, also, you know, for all the energy, and you know, it's kind of an interest of his, but the energy in the making of them, nothing really feels incidental. You know, I mean, that's why they take on. I mean, I think he was working in this kind of flurry. So they have what I again sometimes tell my students is every square inch really feels like he's been there. It wasn't like he left it, you know, was unaware. You know, it's like, and that sounds like an obvious thing, but a lot of people paint with a lot of filler and peripheral and incidental crap. You know, very superficial. Every square inch feels like it's invested, even if it's a gash. You know, it feels like he's walked there a little bit, and that's kind of amazing since he obviously was almost burning up with them in terms of the time frame he was doing them in. You know, so.
Absolutely. And I mean, just to have something that's a much more modest scale, that is so full of the essence of the energy, and then it's hard to tell. These are pretty large paintings.
They're more mid-size, right?
But he is sort of giving us his all, especially in these works when he was in his 80s.
Yeah. Well, there's that, we can't all do this either, we should remember. Not only we can't do it, for obvious reasons, but, there's a documentary about him that showed, well, I forget who it is talking about him, but it just says how he would take the, tubes of paint and just, so the stuff went on, even when he wasn't affording it early on, he was using paint like that. So there's, heavy paint's exciting, but it's a real drag when all of a sudden you don't have it. You got, you got to be able to carry this out. So.
Yeah, totally. I want to know what you think about this painting. This is the last painting in the show.
I could have had this one the same way as the Lucidus Ordo there. I just, it has a little the same thing for me. I love the amount of white. I love kind of a color bounce that happens on the white. Has little connections to Moreau, really. A very,
Well, and he loved Moreau.
Yeah, he did.
And in his collection.
So a little of that, willingness to let a color stand and not necessarily balance it or anything, So, I love this painting, actually.
So I'm curious. I asked Stella, I said, if you could ask Hoffman a question, what would you ask him? And he very practically said, well, I would just ask him where he got the paint. Which I thought was so great. But I'm going to ask you the same question. I mean, you've had such a profound teaching career and a profound painting career yourself.
Yeah. I think I'd be interested in knowing more about the painting being put on hold when he left, Europe and got here. I'd just like to know what that. It obviously got to him a little later. I mean, he wasn't happy with that state. But I'd be very curious what he was thinking, because he was clearly giving himself over to teaching. And that's another reason. It was people were much slower to react to him. The respect for him as a teacher was well known, but they really were slow to kind of recognize that he was the equal of anything going on there. But during that time, he's clearly, I mean, the things look like he's rolling down a window and doing ink drawings. I just don't know how. I wonder how that felt. Whether that was driving him crazy. Yeah. Or he thought he was biding his time, or there was going to be a different time. That I'd be curious about. I don't think I'd be in a position to ask anything else brighter.
Well, I think it's brilliant. I think the 40s, when he's painting in the 40s, I think is his most experimental decade, actually, because he goes right back to his early days as a student with those interiors, with those landscapes, Matisse, Cezanne, Picasso. There's this lovely cubist piece in the show, and he sort of masters those tools probably again. Reintroduces himself again, and then just totally soars. And he has, I think, this amazing exchange with his students that give him that.
That definitely. Energy, I think so. I mean, it's according to John, when he came, someone had told him about him. He didn't know him out in Berkeley, because John was in San Francisco in the late 40s. But someone told him, so he came. It's because someone saw. John had work just like like Hoffman, that seemed to anticipate things that were starting to happen in New York school. And he was kind of, and was being seen in the 47 or so. And so he came east to work with Hoffman because someone encouraged the connection. And Hoffman's first remark, and maybe he said this to everybody, but according to John, Hoffman's remark after seeing John's work was, well, why do you want to work with me? And so, but it might have been his own kind of, there was a mixture of great energy, but also this humility about the endeavor, I think, and so I can see him just being praiseworthy of what he was looking at without necessarily meaning you don't need me.
Right.
I don't know,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Amazing. Well,
If I had one more question for him, it would be like, what did he? If you've ever seen pictures of his home, he colored his furniture, cobalt blue, cerulean blue. Well,
yeah.
oh man, I would love to do that. My wife is cringing, but
I know.
that's.
How do we feel about that?
So I'd
Living in a
ask him
painting.
where the furniture was.
That's a good question. I think we're
done.
we're good. I love. This is Hoffman's quote about finishing.
Yeah.
When do you know you're done?
Right.
With a painting, which I loved, which
Yeah,
you totally articulated.
Yeah.
When they all start to work together
Right.
and create sort of
Is
their
it-
own dimension.
It wasn't him, but someone else from that group who said you can't take anything out and you can't put anything else in. So it's kind of.
I love that. And that's it. That's the last slide.
That's it.
Thank you both, Tim and Lydia.